Welcome back to another Touchpoint Group Banking App Insights session. We are looking at the US categories for the month of September, and it is going to be a case in this session of not just looking at US Bank versus Citibank, some of the leading contenders in that region, but also iOS versus Android. And some of the lessons that any of you can take out of this is it's not enough just to focus on the features and journeys in your app. You need to also be incredibly cognizant of designing and developing for each of those platforms. Tony, we're going to have a look at this massive variation between the performance of Citibank on iOS versus Android in comparison to US Bank. And I'm really looking forward to this because it's actually a massive eye-opener.
It is, Glenn, yeah, definitely. So we'll cover off and have a look at some of the scores across these other banks as well to see how they're performing. But you're right, Citibank versus US Bank is a nice one to look at. And we'll show you why in a moment and get to some of that detail. But let's jump in and have a look at how each of these banks has performed into September. So let's have a look at here's one of the ones we'll cover off in a moment, US Bank. It's a very solid performer, a few dips across time. They're very structured in the way they release their apps, and that's why they're getting a 4.7 plus consistent score. PNC has had some trouble recently, sort of getting below that 3.5 level, although recently they've actually picked themselves up July, August, September, so solidly moving forward. But again, they've only at that 4 level. They should be up above that. Capital One, now we've watched this across time before as well, and that subtle movement, I'm not sure if they're aware, because month by month is a very small movement, but clearly we're seeing this here as well. And as you're aware, the regular watchers will be aware that this is what we call the engaged customer score. So it's customers giving both a score and a comment. So we know exactly why these movements have happened, and also these movements are a lot more subtle, or we can pick up subtle movement as compared to some of the internal metrics that a lot of these banks will get. So they've gone from 4.4 and they're sitting at around 4. It's flat across into September, but they need to watch to stop that continued decline. Truist. Now, Truist is on the rise, so it's a great sort of lesson for them about they've actually pushed themselves forward. All the effort they've put into that is actually coming off. And then now they were sitting last out of this particular group about a year ago. Now they're second, just behind US Bank, so very, very positive. So let's move forward and have a look at some other banks in here. So now this is our second one we'll look at a bit later, is Citibank, doing well, and we'll see later on, do some comparisons in there as well. Chase have actually picked themselves up across time. And now let's have a look at some others in here. So Discover Financial, they have had that drop in February. This is the start of the year, and they haven't picked up since. They need to really sort out why that's going on. We know why that's happening from in the data, but they need to understand that as well and then move themselves back up to where they were. So a change, you want to make sure those changes are going to have a positive impact, but it's been nearly a year, nearly 8-9 months since that's happened, and they need to pick themselves back up pretty fast. So let's have a look at a few others. There's a lot happening in the US. Now, one of the interesting moves here is Fifth Third. They obviously had a massive bottoming out at 1.5, the score there, that's sort of near the lowest you can go. They've really had a really consistent movement up. But again, that movement looks really great, except when you realize they've only just achieved just above 3. And as we saw in the other categories, above 4 is probably is where you're starting to hit the good area. So even if they continue this movement, they've got a long way to grow to get above that 4 level. A few others in here. Let's have a look at Citizens. They're sort of struggling and sort of moving slightly down, so they need to sort of understand why that's going on as well. Now, one of the other movements is interesting is TD. So TD were historically sitting pretty high, and one of the highest in this group. But across the past year, they're sort of averaging around 3, and in September, unfortunately, they've hit the lowest point across the past year. But again, there's room to improve from them, but we won't focus on that for this month. Let's have a look at some interesting things. Let's go head to head, Citi versus US Bank. So let's battle these two banks out and see who's performing well and not so well. So we saw they were actually top of their game in the two categories we had before. Let's look at them side by side. Obviously, the scale's changed here because these banks are doing very well, and we're getting sort of some movements as to what's happening with both of these banks. But clearly, Citibank is underperforming compared to US Bank. Although when I say underperforming, Citibank's doing well. Even its lowest point, it's above 4.4. So very solid for Citibank. But of course, why that gap? What's going on? We need to understand that so then we can see what they can do to actually leapfrog US Bank, or at least get up to their level. First of all, this is the first thing I'd like to look at, is how does it compare across various categories? I'm now looking at, I'll show you the filters here. I'm now looking at, jump in here, I'm looking at Android. So I've just looked at Android only. One of the things you notice, Citibank is ahead. So we saw before it was always behind, but for Android, it's always ahead. And there's a bit of a dip there for US Bank. But again, the story's the same. It's always ahead, which means you'll know what's going to happen if I switch it across to iOS. You'll see exactly what's going on. I'll go there, and let's choose iOS and compare these two side by side. So here we can see clearly Citibank iOS is having a problem. There's a massive gap between it and US Bank. And we can see that US Bank has actually done very well, very consistent for their iOS app version, and sitting at 4.8. So here's the gap that Citi can close. They need to fix this gap with iOS. So let's have a look at that. Let's have a look at iOS and Android. So first of all, I'll look at Android to see where Citi's doing so well. So across the past 3 months, let's have a look at this is just Android. And across these are our high level pain points. So these are all problems. So our frequency is the thing we want to get as low as possible. So we can see here clearly, authentication is slightly above for Citibank. So it's only 2 to 2.5. So not a major thing. The major thing here that's making the difference between these two Android versions of these apps is that reliability and stability is the biggest thing for Citibank. They're actually a lot more reliable in terms of the Android version, which is why they're consistently just ahead of US Bank for the Android app. Let's switch across, though, to have a look at how iOS is going for these two. Clear away Android, and I'll move into iOS. Let's see exactly what's going on. Very different story. We saw the stark contrast in the scores previously. So we can see here, this is just looking at iOS and comparing US Bank and Citibank. And again, the lower the score, the better. This is about problems. And clearly, authentication's a problem for Citibank at 7%, and also reliability and stability at only 20%. So 1 in 5 customers talking about the iOS app are talking about reliability and stability problems. And we can see how well US Bank is doing. So you can see what's possible. They're doing really well here. And Citibank can actually, if they achieve this, they can actually go ahead of US Bank. But a fair way to improve from this point on. Let's have a look, though, at some of these journeys. So these are some of the things, the major things customers are doing with the app, the major journeys, the major things they're trying to achieve. If we look on the right here, the 3 on the right, this is looking at Android. So as you recall, Citibank is actually doing better on Android. And so it's actually doing better on these 3 things: paying bills, monitoring account activity, and checking your account balance. 3 of the major things you want to be doing with your banking app. Whereas they're slightly behind with Android on transferring between accounts and check deposit. So if they pick up there, they can even actually go further ahead from US Bank on Android. But now let's have a look again, the contrast. How is iOS going? This is where Citibank falls down. Let's switch across to that and go to iOS and have a look and compare these again, but on iOS. So clearly there's problems happening here. So those things where Android's doing well about things like monitoring account activity and checking your account balance, they're clearly a lot lower. US Bank has done really, really well to have a very consistent iOS app, and that's what Citibank need to do to close that gap overall between these two banks and their app performance. One of the last things I want to look at is how Citibank Android and Citibank iOS, how they compare side by side. So let's compare those two. So in blue here we have Citibank Android, and in orange we have Citibank iOS. What this score is showing us here is how much the score is being dragged backwards by this particular element, these particular problems. So if I look at the very first one here, reliability and stability, With Android, the score's only been dragged back by 0.09, so about 0.1. So not a major impact on the score. It's only a sort of a soft impact on the score. Whereas if I look at Citibank iOS, the score is being dragged back by 0.43. So clearly reliability problems, which are connected to technical issues, this second one along, are dragging that score back in a strong way. So getting the reliability up for iOS, Citibank is the number one. Number two is authentication. That again is dragging the score back by a long way for iOS Citibank. And there's actually other sub-detail here around login errors and bugs, crashes and freezes, and things like some design in UI, but it's not major. It's around getting those basics right to be able to log in and actually having the app not crash on you is the major thing there. Some clear direction for Citibank, and they can actually get ahead of US Bank, who is doing very well. So thank you, Glenn.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating stuff, Tony. Just to reiterate, you can design the app around the journeys. You can design your app in and around all of those functions and features that you want in it, but you have to be so cognizant of the difference in performance on each of the operating systems. We will look at this again in the future on the various other banks because it is fascinating, I'm sure, for all to see. And if you want to talk about your banking app, feel free to reach out to Tony or I or any of the Touchpoint team, and we can set up a meeting with you. Cheers, team.